for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country. Okay?
At 4:12 a.m., Minneapolis looked frozen in suspension, an entire city pinned beneath the cold breath drifting off the Mississippi as if time itself refused to move. Street lamps flickered through the fog, their halos trembling against the icy stillness. Then, from the edges of downtown, 21 unmarked federal convoys slid into the frame like shadows breaking formation. Tires whispered over frost-hardened asphalt. Engines murmured under the weight of winter air. Nothing about their movement belonged to an ordinary morning. It was the choreography of a mission designed to shatter illusions. Every organization orbiting Warsami Somali Youth Pathways, North Cedar Development Cultural Uplift Foundation, Riverside Equity Group looked legitimate on paper. In reality, they formed a laundering engine powering a Somali cartel network embedded deep in the Midwest. Federal auditors discovered years of financial patterns invisible to the public eye, small transfers routed through Nairobi, larger bursts through Oman anonymous donations in Qatari riyals, cryptocurrency flows that vanished into mixers in under 3 seconds. Money trails still led offshore. Communications nodes were still active. Associates who escaped were still hiding. Half-finished identities were still in circulation. And the cartels tied to Warsami weren't going to accept defeat quietly. Operation Northfall had cracked the hidden architecture. Now came the fight to dismantle every remaining beam. In the days that followed, Minnesota found itself living in a strange duality. Half relieved the fortress had fallen, half terrified by what its existence implied. Federal command centers buzzed day and night analysts, tracing offshore transfers, triangulating burner phone signatures, dissecting every entry in Warsami's digital archives. Because the truth was unavoidable. The empire he built hadn't died with his arrest, it had only been exposed. And exposure triggers survival. Foreign accounts fluttered with suspicious withdrawals, encrypted channels pulsed with frantic reorganizing, unidentified couriers attempted border crossings, a stash house in Wisconsin emptied hours before arrival, a boat on Lake Superior vanished from radar after loading crates near Thunder Bay. The network was still alive, wounded, but alive. Meanwhile, the political sphere convulsed. National outlets framed the case as the most sophisticated domestic infiltration in recent Midwestern history. Congressional hearings loomed. State officials faced scrutiny. Trust in the city's governance cratered. But beneath the political frenzy, something deeper shifted. Ordinary Minnesotans, neighbors, workers, immigrants, students began reevaluating everything they assumed about safety leadership institutions and the fragility of public trust. The cartel didn't choose Warsami because he was influential. He was influential because the cartel had chosen him. In Somali communities, elders led healing circles for families who felt betrayed not just by a criminal, but by a man who had weaponized their hope. They spoke of rebuilding, reclaiming dignity, and refusing to let one man's exploitation define an entire people. Federal teams, meanwhile, prepared Phase 2, a long-term dismantling of the cartel branches that Warsami once shielded. Informants were relocated, surveillance units deployed, forensic accountants dug through years of doctored ledgers. But no one underestimated the next battle. Cartels respond to exposure with aggression, networks respond to collapse with adaptation, and a political shield like Warsami is not replaced easily. Inside a federal briefing room, a senior DHS strategist summarized what every agent already sensed in their bones. This wasn't a takedown, this was an opening act. The room fell silent, because they understood what that meant. Minnesota wasn't cleaning up a crime. Minnesota was entering a war, one fought across boardrooms, shell companies, encrypted channels, backroom deals, abandoned barns, and snow-covered forests where footprints vanish overnight. Warsami's empire had cracked, but its roots were still alive. Still deep, still dangerous. But the betrayal ran deeper. Inside a hidden room behind the pantry, agents found the blueprint of his real empire: whiteboards, tracking distribution routes, hard drives, compiling forged identities, and a binder detailing 23 shell corporations, each one a ghost, a mask, a channel for money migrants or weapons. And the state's greatest test wasn't the battle it had just survived, but the one rushing toward it. The story of Operation Northfall unfolds like a cinematic investigative thriller, exposing the rise and unraveling of a hidden criminal state built beneath the quiet streets of Minneapolis. It begins at 4:12 a.m. with federal convoys gliding through frozen darkness to breach the mansion of Councilman Ibrahim Warsami, a man celebrated publicly as a symbol of unity, but secretly functioning as the architect of a Somali cartel empire. Inside his home, agents uncovered drugs, weapons forged, passports, shell corporations, encrypted encrypted devices and a blueprint for structural infiltration, reaching into city government immigration channels and community nonprofits. As investigators dig deeper, they uncover Warsami's most staggering secret, a fully operational cartel fortress hidden in northern Minnesota, built with military precision and powered by forced labor. Drone footage reveals heat signatures, armed guards, generators disguised as silos, and an off-grid manufacturing hub supplying narcotics across the Midwest. What follows is a multi-agency assault executed under winter darkness, culminating in the rescue of hostages, the collapse of the compound, and the exposure of a criminal network far larger than anyone imagined. But destruction of the fortress triggers a statewide shockwave. Cartel operatives scatter, stash houses ignite, and panic identities vanish. Trucks are abandoned, and over 90 individuals tied to the network are arrested. Minnesota erupts in outrage. City Hall becomes a battleground of grief and fury. Somali communities mourn not a leader, but the betrayal of one. Investigations reveal that Warsami had not infiltrated the system. He had constructed a parallel one within it, embedding corruption through nonprofit shell companies and compromised officials. Survivor testimonies from the fortress transformed the scandal into a moral reckoning. Their stories of captivity, labor under threat, and silent suffering forced Minnesota to confront the depth of the exploitation that occurred under its nose. In the aftermath, the state grapples with a harsh truth. The empire did not die, it was exposed. Offshore accounts flicker with activity, communications networks shift, and missing associates attempt escape. Federal teams enter Phase 2, preparing for a long-term dismantling of the remaining branches. Operation Northfall proves one thing: corruption doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it stands at a podium, smiles warmly, and thanks you for your vote. Even more disturbing were the passport kits. Warsami wasn't just forging documents, he was manufacturing entire American lives for cash-complete identities sold to desperate migrants who believed he was helping them. Some were funneled into the cartel's labor network, others into distribution routes. A few simply disappeared. Phone records exposed years of encrypted conversations with cartel lieutenants, corrupt municipal processors, immigration clerks, and business owners who exchanged silence for payment. Yet no threats were ever recorded. He didn't need to threaten. His charm did the work. His influence did the rest. Each new threat investigators pulled revealed another overdose cluster in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, each tied back to shipments he approved. And while families grieved, he stood at vigils with a hand over his heart, offering condolences he knew were built on lies. When analysts finally decrypted his hard drive, the truth was unmistakable. Warsami wasn't a politician corrupted by a cartel. He was the architect of a hidden state growing beneath Minneapolis. Federal analysts had barely worked 6 hours on the devices seized from Warsami's mansion when a pattern began whispering through the data, subtle at first, then unmistakably deliberate. Folder names disguised as grocery lists, GPS logs mislabeled as charity visits, heat maps buried under the metadata of holiday event flyers. Layer by layer, investigators peeled back the camouflage, revealing something that stretched far beyond document fraud, political infiltration, or narcotics distribution. Warsami wasn't just assisting a cartel operation, he was shielding its crown jewel. One folder stood out: winter event planning, but inside were no calendars, no catered menus, no community gatherings. Instead, investigators found drone coordinates captured over months, pointing deep into the northern Minnesota wilderness, an area supposedly empty, devoid of utilities, roads, or registered structures. But the infrared snapshots told a different story. Industrial heat signatures patterned vehicle movement, human activity in a place where no humans were meant to be. As the convoys tightened their perimeter, the narrative snapped into focus. 6 vehicles peeled left, 5 circled to the rear. The remaining teams boxed the front gate of a 3-story brick mansion, glowing with a warm, peaceful light, an image so deceptively calm it felt scripted by a liar. Inside lived Councilman Ibrahim Warsami, Minneapolis's polished symbol of unity, progress, and community uplift. To the city, he was a beacon. To federal investigators, he was a tunnel one that burrowed deep into cartel darkness. When the first reconnaissance drone reached the coordinates, the truth emerged like a nightmare rising from the tree line. Beneath a canopy of winter bare branches lay a fortress, rectangular structures, reinforced roofs, ventilation shafts, lookout posts masquerading as hunting blinds, and steel mesh fencing topped with fresh razor wire. But the most chilling detail was human movement. Dozens of individuals, slow, repetitive, synchronized. Not workers, not employees, hostages, forced labor, a human engine powering the cartel's production line. Trucks sat under camouflaged netting engines warmed at timed intervals. A hidden airstrip cut through the snow. Satellite dishes pointed toward Canadian relays. Generators hummed beneath faux storage silos. Every detail reflected military-grade design, impossible to build legally and impossible to detect without deliberate intent. This wasn't a warehouse, not a camp, not a hideout. It was the operational heart of the Somali cartel's Upper Midwest Empire, a fully realized off-grid manufacturing state protected by a politician sitting on the Minneapolis City Council. When the 3D reconstruction appeared on screens at the Federal Command Center, the shift was immediate and irrevocable. This could not stand another night, another shipment, another hostage screaming into chemicals, another unseen burial beneath snow. The order was issued with cold surgical clarity. Prepare for a coordinated multi-agency assault, blind their surveillance, cut communications, seal escapes, extract hostages, dismantle the fortress, burn the network down to its roots. At 4:12:38, a porch light flickered, caught the rim of a tactical helmet, and then exploded into shards as the breaching ram tore the door off its hinges. The mansion inhaled the violence. Wood splintered, frames crashed, plaster dust spiraled into flashlight beams, slicing through the dark. FBI surged through the foyer. DHS tactical teams fanned out behind them. ICE enforcement slipped toward the stairwells, moving with a precision more reminiscent of a military incursion than a domestic raid. And as the Minnesota sky darkened under the weight of an approaching storm, federal tactical teams tightened gloves, checked magazines, and prepared to march into a hidden state built on silence, fear, and blood. They launched under a sky so dark it felt pressed against the treetops, a suffocating slab of winter blackness that swallowed sound and light alike. By 2:57 a.m., frozen logging roads were lined with armored carriers. Black Hawks, DHS SRT units, FBI HRT teams, ICE tactical groups, medic signal disruptors, and entire silent army hunched against the cold-breathing vapor clouds that disappeared instantly into the wind. No chatter, no radio checks, just the cold certainty of men and women moving into a battlefield engineered for their death. At 3:11 a.m., the advance began. Teams moved through thigh-high snowdrifts, guided only by night vision halos and a pulsing infrared beacon from the lead scout. Black Hawk skimmed the tree-line rotors suppressed. The wind carved razor lines against exposed skin. Every step forward tightened the wire of inevitability. Phase 1 blind them. From behind a cluster of pines, electronic warfare operators activated a high-frequency jammer. The surge rippled across the compound like a silent quake. Lights flickered, cameras died, radios went dead mid-sentence. Guard towers erupted with frantic confusion as spotters slammed dead receivers against metal rails. Phase 2 breach. Simultaneous charges detonated along the north and east perimeter, ripping open reinforced steel mesh and explosive blossoms of fire and snow. Razor wire folded inward. Agents surged through the breach before debris even finished falling. Cartel gunmen fired wildly into darkness muzzle flashes, betraying their positions. Federal marksmen answered with brutal precision, dropping targets before they could regroup. Then an armored truck burst from the courtyard, its mounted gun lighting up the night with sweeping arcs of fire. It lasted 5 seconds. A DHS operator fired an ATF round that streaked like a falling star, slamming into the engine block and flipping the vehicle in a shower of sparks. The real fight began inside. The first room offered only luxury imported rugs, soft leather, spotless decor, nothing to betray the rot beneath the surface. But the second room did. Reinforced metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with vacuum-sealed bricks of fentanyl and meth crates of short-barreled rifles and suppressors spilling from unzipped duffel bags. Yet even that wasn't the true horror. On a table in the corner lay dozens of US passports, some completed, some half-forged, scattered like deadly playing cards. Photos of undocumented migrants, fabricated identities, fee sheets arranged by risk, urgency, desperation. Flashbangs detonated through stairwells. Hallways became war zones of ricocheting steel and shouting commands. Left clear stack right hall, two secured as operators carved room to room with cold efficiency. Then they found the first processing structure. The chemical stench, the vibrating floor, the hostages blinded, trembling, shrinking from tactical lights as if light itself might hurt them. Medics pulled them out while gunfire cracked in the rafters. Cartel enforcers opened fire from behind mixers and platforms. They fell one by one. The second structure was worse, heavily defended fighters dragging crates toward an underground escape tunnel. But the tunnel never opened. A breaching team had sealed it with thermite. cornered the cartel made its last stand in a narrow corridor that became a storm of bullets, smoke, and steel. At 3:41 a.m. it was over. The fortress fell silent except for collapsing ventilation ducts and the soft sobs of freed captives wrapped in thermal blankets. But even in that silence, every agent knew. Agents pressed deeper. Behind a false pantry wall, a narrow passage revealed a private command office maps, hard drives, shell companies, foreign banking trails, the skeleton of a shadow empire masquerading as a politician's life. This was only the beginning. By the time the final fire inside the ruined fortress hissed into darkness, dawn had already begun bleeding across the Minnesota sky, an indifferent icy light creeping over a battlefield that should never have existed on American soil. Operators stood soaked in sweat despite the cold, surrounded by shattered walls, torched equipment, broken rifles, and footprints of chaos melting slowly into the snow. But there was no victory high, no breath of celebration, because the fall of the fortress was not an ending. It was a detonation, and the shockwave hit before the helicopters lifted off. Intercepted radio bursts short panicked messages in Somali, and English began ricocheting across burner towers from St. Cloud to Rochester Brooklyn Park to Burnsville. Analysts recognized the pattern instantly. The network was reacting, fleeing, destroying evidence, breaking formation. Couriers abandoned stash houses, accountants torched ledgers, drivers dumped trucks along rural roads and fled into the tree line. Middlemen attempted to slip across state lines at dawn, hiding among commuters. At 6:22 a.m., Operation Northfall expanded statewide. In Brooklyn Park, federal teams breached a halal food distributor hiding pallets of narcotics. In Burnsville, ICE intercepted a van filled with forged passports, the same template found beside Warsami's bed. In St. Cloud, cartel drivers rammed a police perimeter, tearing across a frozen field before spike strips shredded their tires. And upstairs on a buzzing cracked phone screen, the final message glowed. Every arrest added another thread, and every thread led back to the same architect, the politician who had built a shadow economy under his city. By sunset, over 90 operatives tied to Warsami's network were in custody. But the public response was even more explosive. News helicopters circled Minneapolis like vultures. Crowds flooded City Hall with signs demanding answers. Some shouted in rage. Others stood in silent disbelief, betrayed by a man they had trusted with their hopes, their stories, their votes. Inside Somali neighborhoods, elders wept openly, not for Warsami, but for those he had used, deceived, and sacrificed for power. Inside government buildings, internal probes erupted. Approvals were questioned, departments implicated, officials suspended. And above it all, one truth hung heavy. Minnesota had not uncovered a criminal, it had uncovered an embedded system. As the statewide crackdown deepened, federal analysts continued dissecting Warsami's hard drives, recovered ledgers, encrypted messages, offshore tokens, and property permits. What emerged was not a web, it was a blueprint drafted with the clarity of an engineer designing a parallel government. Warsami had not infiltrated city structures, he had constructed a shadow machinery within them. Shipment lands tonight. Need your go-ahead. At 4:18 a.m., cuffs locked around Warsami's wrists. The arrest wasn't the climax, it was the ignition spark. Nonprofits that held no events, logistics companies with no trucks, community centers with no staff, development firms with no land. Each served a precise purpose, funneling money-shielding identities, laundering shipments, or purchasing properties for future expansion. And then there were the compromised officials. Signatures on fast-tracked property permits, approvals pushed through by clerks who didn't remember, community leaders receiving consulting fees routed from offshore accounts. Every connection widened the scope. This wasn't corruption, it was structural infiltration. The cartel didn't simply exploit vulnerabilities, it embedded agents, redirected approvals, and built legal facades strong enough to survive any casual audit. The most chilling documents were the political memos, draft speeches, outreach schedules, internal strategy notes, because woven between them were private emails to cartel lieutenants, updates on influence predictions of future authority, and one message that cracked investigators' composure. After next election, expansion becomes easier. Be patient. He wasn't rising despite cartel backing, he was rising for cartel expansion. For years, Minneapolis believed it had watched the rise of a grassroots hero, a soft-spoken community bridge builder who spoke about unity with calm conviction and clasped hands. Ibrahim Warsami, the refugee success story turned councilman, stood in front of cameras with a reassuring smile that people wanted to trust. But once federal investigators began peeling back the polished exterior, the truth emerged not in cracks, but in fractures so deep they split his entire public persona apart. He was their shield, their architect, their statesman. Meanwhile, testimonies from survivors rescued at the fortress painted a picture no report could capture. They described chemical fumes burning their lungs weeks without sunlight, guards pacing with rifles, whispered prayers, and faint hope that someday someone would hear the engines above the tree line and come for them. Their voices transformed this from a political scandal into a moral reckoning. This was not a criminal enterprise. It was a parallel system built on captivity coercion and the quiet purchase of political power. As Minnesota reeled from revelations, another truth became impossible to ignore. This machine had depth, this machine had reach, this machine had been growing for years. And dismantling it would demand something far more complex than raids, arrests, or press conferences. It would require confronting the fact that corruption doesn't always crawl from shadows. Sometimes it stands on a podium, smiles warmly, and thanks you for your vote. With the network collapsing, Minnesota entered a period of public turmoil that felt less like political fallout and more like a collective psychological rupture. Streets outside City Hall swelled with thousands of activists, grieving families, stunned Somali elders, angry business owners, frightened newcomers who had trusted Warsami as a symbol of opportunity. Some demanded resignations, others demanded explanations, many demanded justice. The first questions were simple. Where did his early campaign funding originate? Why did his nonprofits file no public records? How did he afford a mansion on a councilman's salary? Why did his logistics company list 8 vehicles while the DMV listed none? Each question led not to answers, but to revelations cascading undeniable damning. But beneath the noise lay a quieter, sharper wound, the fracture of trust. In a state that prided itself on multicultural unity and civic transparency, discovering that a beloved figure had built a cartel gateway beneath public institutions struck with the force of a moral earthquake. Government departments scrambled to distance themselves. Audits launched overnight. Emergency sessions convened in the state legislature. Federal briefing requests poured in. The Minneapolis City Council held a televised session that devolved into emotional chaos. Some members trembled as they spoke. Others stared blankly at screens displaying recovered documents, unable to reconcile the smiling man they knew with the architect of a criminal state. Meanwhile, survivors from the fortress, wrapped in blankets, clutching cups of tea, gave quiet testimonies in undisclosed facilities. Their words poured gasoline onto the public firestorm. They spoke of labor under threat, of guards beating those who slowed, of weeks without seeing the sun, of whispered prayers, of counting footsteps in the dark, of losing hope, then hearing helicopters. Their survival turned Operation Northfall into something larger than a takedown. It became a referendum on how deeply a system can rot before anyone notices. Religious leaders held vigils for the victims. Community centers created emergency support funds. Statewide narcotics awareness campaigns surged. A wave of political reform proposals swept across the Capitol. But even as Minnesota united against the wreckage, a chilling truth grew increasingly clear. The machine hadn't been fully destroyed, it had been disrupted. There is a difference.